Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Deeper Take, where I investigate the structure and content of an essay that I recently found interesting in an effort to move the quality of our discussions in culture from the level of conversation to the level of decision. And this week's essay is Michelle Goldberg's Don't Let Politics Cloud Your View of What's Going On with Teens and Depression. This was printed in the New York Times on February 24th, 2023. Of the 17 paragraphs in Goldberg's Don't Let Politics Cloud Your View of What's Going On with Teens and Depression, the first 8 of them are dedicated to Goldberg's displaying her on-ramp, that she has struggled to understand why liberal-leaning teens are more depressed than their conservative counterparts. And in this on-ramp, she admits that her initial attempt to understand the subject, why politics and depression are linked, were insufficient. It isn't clear, at least from this writing, that her current effort has brought her any further along, that she's any clearer. In the 9th paragraph, she's actually passing the critical thinking off to Jonathan Haidt, who mentions that social media is the cause or potential cause for linking depression and politics. And the rest of the essay is going to continue to paint social media and not politics as the cause, and end with the statement, quote, that unaccountable corporate behemoths are harming kids with their products. Before Goldberg gets there, though, she takes another run at the worldview that she admittedly once had, and she quotes people with similar views. And they include the Washington Post Taylor Lorenz, who writes that, quote, we never mention the fact that we are living in a late-stage capitalist hellscape during an ongoing deadly pandemic. And she quotes others describing depression as a result of sexual violence or dehumanization, which makes, quote, their depression actually very reasonable. Goldberg assesses that her own point of view, and these are incomplete, if not wrong, in the next paragraph. And she says they do not line up with the data in the studies that she's seen. And so what strikes me as interesting, then, is that we have an essay purporting to tell us that we shouldn't let politics cloud our view of what's going on with teens and depression. But we don't yet have any cogent argument being made for why we shouldn't let politics cloud our view of what's going on with teens and depression. We, in fact, seem to have an author who recognizes her own conflict with the argument. And this makes the essay interesting from a psychological point of view, if we were to focus on the author, but fairly useless from a public point of view. And it raises the question, should the New York Times, or should the focus of any New York Times essays be the psychological difficulty that an author has with her own arguments? Or does one expect that the arguments an author makes are considered enough before writing, that the author's own psychological blocks are sidelined in order to create an insight that provides clarity for the reader? This essay is perhaps printed too early. Another 3 or 4 drafts were needed, and deeper investigations of the author's own mindset may have shortened and deepened this essay and made it a reader-centric, not a writer-centric essay. But we don't have the investigations of 3 or 4 more drafts. They didn't seem to be done. Goldberg's own worldview seems to be insufficient for taking on the topic. She has blind spots. And so she opts for third-party data from experts, including people like Jonathan Haidt. But those blind spots become more of an issue in the essay than any deep assessment she's making from the information she's gleaned from those people. That social media exists, has potentially negative, and that it has potentially negative consequences is something that, for instance, my undergraduates could have written. It's not necessarily incorrect, but it's not necessarily new. It's not necessarily interesting, deep, or worthy of the standard New York Times reader's time. The far more interesting questions are the ones unasked in the essay. What is it that liberals and conservatives are consuming on social media? And why would, if social media is the cause, why would one lead liberals, especially female liberals, to be more depressed than conservatives? If social media is the cause, What is the information that is being gathered on social media, and how are liberals and conservatives interpreting those same messages or different messages differently? And why does one lead to more depression than the other? Investigating what happens for liberals and conservatives on social media, the concrete structure, who is being followed, and what messages are being heard, strikes me as a necessary data and assessment point to arrive at the conclusion that we shouldn't let politics cloud our view of what's going on with teens and depression. But Goldberg herself seems to have trouble removing politics from the essay, which makes it impossible for us to learn from any assessments that she might have had about why politics should be removed. For instance, instead of investigating the structure of what's being witnessed by liberals and conservatives, or how those assessments might be different from different backgrounds, Goldberg brings in politics, and early, to the detriment of her own credibility to assess the issue. In the second paragraph, she mentions, quote, the dire psychological fallout of Donald Trump's abusive presidency. The words dire and abusive are not necessary, but included, which leads the reader to question not Donald Trump's presidency, because I don't expect that those two words would alter one's opinions of Donald Trump's presidency, no matter what they thought of it. It leads the reader to ask, why did this author include those words? And can I trust any assessments that she makes about political subjects if she defaults to those words, likely subconsciously, in the second paragraph of an essay that purports to be non-political, before she has any significant data to detail to support any claims? A similar issue arises in the paragraphs 10 and 11. Space used to detail where the writer and people with the writer's worldview, like the writer, are, by the writer's own admission, incorrect in their assessments. Space that could have been used to delve into more exactly what the social media messages are and potential ways they could be assessed or interpreted by different political wings. I'm writing about this essay today because I think the topic is terrifically important. I teach undergraduates, some of whom are depressed. But this opportunity is missed. For instance, if conservative young people follow people like Jordan Peterson, who can be difficult in his own right, but if they do, and if they learn to make a case for behavioral change as a way of stabilizing life decisions, does that give the conservative student a roadmap for decision-making that makes them less prone to depression? That would be a far more interesting question to me than touching on, but bouncing off, quote, the late capitalist hellscape language that Goldberg chose to include, but even there, not fully investigate. One might be left to infer exactly political outcomes from an essay that proposes outcomes are not political. One investigative question not asked or answered: if people read on social media that they live in late capitalist hellscapes, is it social media that is depressing, or the messaging that exists on social media, which one self-selects? The next reasonable question then is, if it is the messaging accurate? To this, I wonder if a serious discussion of capitalism has taken place. It isn't clear to me, at least directly, that we are in late capitalism. In fact, if one is familiar with demographic trends, one might reasonably expect the US to continue its economic stature and dollar stature for at least the next few generations. If it's late for the US, demographically speaking, it is later elsewhere. And the places the US might be superseded by in 50 years are also developing capitalist understanding. See Eastern Europe, which may stabilize the EU in future generations while demographic changes affect Western Europe, in particular Germany. If the purpose of an essay is to present information that one can make decisions from, we have an interesting but not fully informed or investigated essay. Unfortunately, we have an uninformed essay around a topic that we very much need informed decisions. We have a non-argument argument that seems to detail a worldview that the author is struggling with and is having trouble removing from her own perception in order to help us see it more clearly. Every week, I am going to continue to critique a recent essay that I find worthy of investigating. and diving into more deeply. And in doing so, I hope we prompt both the type of critical thinking that's necessary for good writing and good reading, and therefore inspire better writing from the public and better reading from the public. In this particular essay, I wonder if more questions were necessary to get to the root of the issues in play, and whether the author, who seems to be aware of her own investigative blind spots, which I recognize and congratulate her on, needed help with those questions from an editor or an outside source. In either case, the essay doesn't live at the level of decision, but it might have, with 3 or 4 more gutsy investigative drafts, it might have gotten close to being there. And this is the work that I suspect all of our journalists need to do, but likely won't do unless we demand it of them. It also strikes me that this is the gap that our current thought leaders are leaving. And for those who investigate well and who contribute well, this is the gap that I think we have an obligation to wonder if we can fill. Please subscribe to this channel for more videos like this one. They're going to be coming once per week.